The mandate for missionary work in Australia was largely brought about through the lobbying of evangelical Christian groups in England during the 1820s and the 1830s. Those groups, who were largely made up of figures from the abolition movement, framed the debate about civilising Indigenous peoples of the British colonies in a framework of justice and atonement for the misconduct of settlers. A British inquiry called the Select Committee on Aborigines 1835 to 1836, whose report you can see on screen there, was set up to discuss the issue, looking both at the Australian and the African British colonies. The concern of the committee was that the interaction between colonists and Indigenous peoples would eventually result in the extinction of the latter, indeed highlighting what was a severe depopulation in Australia of its Indigenous peoples at the time. Now, the report was not without controversy. The colonisation of Australia was never intended to be a humanitarian mission, and concerned settlers and pastoralists responded to the committee by arguing that their more so-called civilised use of the land and their expansion of the British Empire was in itself a virtuous cause. Nevertheless, the Select Committee's report did have the effect of establishing a British protectors of Aboriginal people in the Victorian and South Australian colonies, and it sparked an early attempt by the New South Wales government at establishing Aboriginal homesteads. Now, all of these early homesteads and missions were considered to be failures by the government. The Protectorate's progress in improving the outcomes of Indigenous peoples was severely hampered by a wave of violence in the 1840s that was accompanied with the expansion of pastoralism in the colonies. By 1849, the Protectorate program itself was disbanded, although not before the superintendent of Port Phillip, whose name was Charles Joseph Latrobe, had asked the Moravian Church to intervene and establish its own mission in the region. The Moravians had undertaken similar projects in other colonies throughout the British Empire with some success. Their early work in the colonies of what is now South Africa had actually been used as evidence in the Select Committee's report. Now, the Moravians were not the only ones engaged by the government, however, as strong humanitarian concerns had been raised over the violence of the 1840s. The government re-established a formal system to replace the old protectorates in 1860, which was called the Central Board for the Protection of the Aborigines. This board had funding and responsibility for the administration of 6 Aboriginal stations, including the Moravians' new Ebenezer mission in the Wimmera region of northwest Victoria, which you can see in the beautiful painting on screen.